Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Phil Norris, and I would like to talk with you just for a few minutes about the status of our federal government and our nation in general. If you're like me, you have noticed that our government has changed over the past few years and even the past few decades. Most of my close friends and family and I have a discussion about the state of our country almost on a continuous basis. Now, when I was growing up in Hamilton, Alabama, the government seemed to be more in touch with the people that paid their taxes and who expected that the government would fulfill its role by exercising the enumerated powers that were outlined in the U.S. Constitution. The government wasn't perfect, but at least there was some feel that our government leaders and our government officials were accountable to the people that had elected them. These days, I don't feel that our federal government is very accountable to we the people. Our freedoms are being jeopardized almost every day in Congress, when Congress is in session, and quite frankly, our current president has lost touch with me as a constitutionally minded citizen. Well, I decided to do something about this feeling, so I've been reading extensively over the past 3 or 4 years, trying to figure out how our government got in the shape we're in, and more importantly, how we need to go about changing our government back to what our founding fathers envisioned when they formed our nation over 200 years ago. And I'd like to talk about some of the books that I've read that have opened my eyes to some of the things that maybe you need to be aware of too as a citizen of this country. And maybe you have the same concerns that I do. Well, one of the most memorable books that I read was America, the Last Best Hope by Dr. William Bennett. He was the Secretary of Education under President Reagan, and Dr. Bennett wrote at least 3 volumes to this book. They document modern history, beginning with the drafting of the Magna Carta, which this year we're celebrating the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta by King John. And they take us up to about 2010 in these books. Now, these books talk about the true history of our country. I read Volume 2 first, which begins after World War I and ends in 1989, after the fall of the Soviet Union and communism, their brand of communism. I chose this volume to read first because it talks about how things began to take shape during and immediately after the Great Depression. There were several stopgap measures that our government came up with to put the country back on a solid foundation, at least for the moment. Now, Dr. Bennett talks about how a lot of the social programs that we have today in our government got started. And Dr. Bennett also talked about how the government was being operated behind the scenes during these times, the deal-making, the wrangling, the arm-twisting, and all the antics of a whole list of politicians throughout the period in that time in our history. I feel quite confident that not much of this was taught in our high school history classes. Dr. Bennett's goal for writing this series of books was to better educate our citizens on our true history and how our government has actually worked over the past several decades. Now, in addition to reading Dr. Bennett's books, one of my concerns over the past few years has been the threat of the collapse of the U.S. dollar or hyperinflation. I spent 6 years in the financial industry during the period from 2004 to 2010 and watched bank after bank fail and financial institution after financial institution fail. I watched clients of my company deal with the devaluing of their investment accounts. That was a direct result of the mismanagement of our government's role in the financial stability of our nation. So I picked up 2 books that dealt with the financial matters. One was entitled The Foreclosure of America, which is an inside story of the rise and fall of countrywide home loans, the mortgage crisis, and the default of the American dream, and it was written by Adam Michelson. The second book was a book by Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman entitled Money Mischief. Money Mischief describes the evolution of currency throughout recorded history and discusses our modern-day financial system and the role and influence of our Federal Reserve on our overall economy today. He also talks about how currency has been manipulated over time and can be manipulated in our current political climate. These were definitely eye-opening books for me and 2 books that were well worth the time to read. Now, in addition to reading extensively over the past few years, I've also tried to educate myself better on the U.S. Constitution and how our government was formed way back in colonial days. I took a course offered by Hillsdale College entitled Constitution 101. This course was brilliantly developed and eloquently delivered by different faculty members of Hillsdale College. And in that course, I learned about a concept called the American mindset. The American mindset. The American mindset described basically what our founding fathers and the citizens of their time valued in relation to their freedoms and their government. They certainly weren't happy with the tyrannical government of the British homeland at all. The American mindset of the period was all about individualism, property ownership, a less intrusive government, and the right to self-govern, with an emphasis on all the inalienable rights that they felt all human beings were granted by God, not by the government, but by God. Some of these were the right to free speech, the freedom to practice your religion, the right to keep and bear arms, and this is just a few of those rights, inalienable rights. In addition to the Hillsdale College course, I began to listen to Dr. David Barton, who founded an organization called the Wall Builders. Dr. Barton was a career educator, and he decided that the true American history wasn't being taught in our schools. And he set out to correct that, and he began to do research, and he began to uncover documents in public and private collections that pointed to a different recollection of the founding of our nation than what had been taught in the world of academia. Dr. Barton talks about the Christian principles that our nation was founded on, and recounts several episodes where this was evident in our founding documents. He tells the story of how the 35th Psalm was read by Pastor Duché during the First Continental Congress that met in 1774 in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. He talks about the obvious divine selection of President George Washington to be our first president of the United States. It's really good stuff. More recently, I picked up the book, The 5,000-Year Leap, which was published by the National Center for Constitutional Studies. This book will lead me into a very deep discussion over the coming weeks as I post excerpts from this book on YouTube for you to enjoy and for you to educate yourself on what's really going on with our government. The book was written for the purpose of educating all Americans on what the principles are that will help preserve our union for many generations to come. It is a call to action, I believe. Now, if you don't know, a few months prior to his death, Thomas Jefferson foresaw a time of danger in our country, kind of like what we have now. A time where we would lose sight of the principles that the country was founded on and not have a roadmap to preserve the Union. He pleaded with future Americans to sacrifice whatever it would take to preserve the Charter of Liberty for which he and the other founders had given so much. And this is what he said. Thomas Jefferson said, "We owe every endurable sacrifice to ourselves, to our federal brethren, and to the world at large to pursue with temper and perseverance the great experiment which shall prove that man is capable of living in society, governing itself by laws self-imposed, and securing to its members the enjoyment of life, liberty, property, and peace." End of quote. Jefferson then explained why we should not lose hope, even when we see our elected officials beginning to abandon the Constitution, much like we see today. Ultimately, he said, the people themselves will restore America to its founding principles. And quoting Jefferson again, he said this, "Even when the government of the nation's choice shall manifest a tendency to degeneracy, we are not at once to despair, because the will and the watchfulness of its sounder parts will reform its aberrations, recall it to original and legitimate principles, and restrain it within the rightful limits of self-government." Now, the book, The 5,000-Year Leap, presents these original and legitimate principles that Jefferson talked about in an easy-to-understand format. Why am I saying all this? Well, it is through this 3 to 4 year journey that I've arrived at this moment, talking to you on a YouTube video about my deep desire, and I feel my God-ordained purpose from this day forward, helping to bring America back through this restoration and bring us back to focus on the original and legitimate principles that this nation was founded on. I've chosen to work on this restoration as I seek to be elected to represent the 4th Congressional District of Alabama. I want to lead the charge as we work together to restore America to something that we will be proud of and our children and grandchildren will be proud of. So today, on Facebook and on YouTube, I announce that I am a candidate for the 4th Congressional District of Alabama. Now, I ask that you join me on this journey because it's a people's journey. Jefferson alluded to it when he spoke about how the sounder parts of the country, which is us, the citizenry, will take charge of our government. This government was originally designed to be of the people, by the people, and for the people. And Thomas Jefferson is counting on us to take back control of our government. And I ask that you join me on this journey, and let's begin this restoration together. Now, I also ask for your prayers and support, which are absolutely paramount for this journey to be successful. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to be called your candidate for the 4th Congressional District of Alabama, and I'm ready to get to work, and I'm ready for you to join me, and I'm ready for you to ask questions and send me a message on my Facebook page, email, on my congressional candidacy website, which is philnorrisforcongress.org, philnorrisforcongress.org. And I want you to join with me in this journey, and I think at the end we'll come out with something great. We'll have a better country than what we have today. We'll go back to those roots, and we'll have a better country to live in. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Phil Norris, and I approve this message. Thank you.